This program is a production of the Colonel Davenport Historical Foundation. This program was supported by the following organizations: the Riverboat Development Authority, the Bechtel Trusts and Foundation, the Figge Foundation, the Hubble-Waterman Foundation, the Hunt and Diane Harris Family Foundation. This program is also supported by Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views and opinions expressed by this program do not necessarily reflect those of Humanities Iowa or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Partial support was provided by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency. He had been a sailor, a soldier, an army supplier, a fur trader, a steamboat captain, a successful businessman, land developer, and the driving force behind the first railroad to cross the Mississippi. During his life, he crossed paths with the famous and the soon-to-be famous, an American president whose blind hatred for the Native Americans earned him the nickname the Old Cree Eater, a general who would later lead a war against Mexico, a colonel who would become the 12th President of the United States, a young surveyor who would later head a great army in this country's most terrible war, an Army lieutenant who would become President of the Confederate States of America, a young captain of the Illinois militia who was our 16th President and would preserve the Union, one of the wealthiest men in America, and a Sauk Indian leader who, though not a chief, would lead his tribe into a war against the United States. And though born and raised in England, his is the quintessential American success story. He was so successful that on what was then known as the far western frontier, he built a house that became famous as the finest mansion between Chicago and St. Louis. It was the house that he worked in, lived in, and was murdered in. His name was Colonel George Davenport. Born in County Lincolnshire, England in 1783, Davenport went to sea at the age of 17 on a merchant ship. 1804 brought him to the harbor of New York City. A shipmate fell overboard, and during the rescue, Davenport was so severely injured that he had to stay in New York as his ship left for home. Davenport soon enlisted in the Army. During the War of 1812, Davenport's regiment was engaged in the bloodiest battle ever fought on Canadian soil, the Battle of Lundy's Lane. During the siege of Fort Erie, he was on duty at one of the cannon batteries night and day, with scarcely a moment's rest. After the battle, the American troops crossed back again to the United States. After Davenport received an honorable discharge, he was employed to supply Army troops with provisions. Taking charge of several keelboats loaded with provisions, he joined up with a regiment of soldiers who were pushing north from St. Louis to establish a new frontier fort. On May 10, 1816, Davenport and the Army troops arrived at their destination, the largest island in the Mississippi River, called Osanominas, or Rocky Island, by the Sauk and Fox Indian tribes who lived nearby. Its first written reference was from early explorations of the Mississippi River Valley after the Louisiana Purchase. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, exploring the valley for fortification sites and native peoples in the summer of 1805, took particular note of Big Island near the Stony River, now called the Rock River. The island was still providing food, water, and tools for the native peoples when Davenport and the Army arrived. The Sauk and Fox tribes were hunters and agriculturalists, and made their primary settlements on the banks of the Mississippi in the area surrounding Rock Island. There were 3 villages in the Rock Island vicinity by the late 18th century: Wapello and Oshkosh, both Fox villages, and Saukenuk, the Sauk village. For the Indians who lived near Rock Island, the arrival of soldiers in 1816 was the first of many changes to come. The U.S. government chose Rock Island as a site for a fort for some of the same reasons that the Sauk and Fox had: its strategic location on the western frontier. Davenport's British heritage was an asset to the United States and helped establish American sympathies with the local tribes. The U.S. claim to this land dated to 1804, the same year Davenport arrived in America, when a treaty was signed with members of the Sauk and Fox tribes. They met with William Henry Harrison, later the 9th President of the United States. Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, which then included what would become Illinois, negotiated a treaty in which the group of Sauk and Fox ceded lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for $1,000 per year and the condition that the tribes could continue to live and hunt there. Later, the group claimed that Harrison used bribery, threats, and liquor to get their agreement. Because of this, the Sauk leader Black Hawk never recognized this treaty. Black Hawk was a fierce warrior who fought alongside the British during the War of 1812. It was at Fort Armstrong in 1818 that Davenport first met Antoine Leclerc. Leclerc was a government interpreter who spoke English, French, Spanish, and at least a dozen American Indian dialects. His mother was Potawatomi, and his father was French-Canadian. Leclerc and Davenport developed a lifelong friendship. As official Army provisioner, Davenport was licensed to supply the troops in the area. Also, as post-provisioner, Davenport was in a position to establish trade with the Sauk, Fox, and Winnebago, who brought their furs to the fort as barter for goods and services. Fort Armstrong was about 270 feet square, with 3 blockhouses mounting 3 cannon. The fort was built on the west point of Rock Island's 30-foot cliffs. Fort Armstrong was isolated from civilization, and life for the soldiers was routine and dreary. But the boredom at Fort Armstrong was to end soon with the approaching clash between the resident Native Americans and newly arriving settlers. Davenport's wife, Margaret Bowling Lewis, soon followed him to Rock Island and a new life on the frontier. She was a widow with 2 children, William and Susan Lewis, who became well acquainted with the local tribes, their languages, and their customs. After 2 years as provisioner, Davenport's position for the Army was eliminated. He then decided to try his luck in the fur trade. He built a double log cabin with a chimney in between. One room was the family's living quarters, while the other side was used for storing goods and furs. The Sauk and Fox considered Davenport to be fair and honest, and soon called him Saganosh, meaning Englishman, which they considered a compliment. Starting in the early 1800s, he established new trading posts all through the upper Mississippi River Valley. Many French Canadians who remained in the area after the War of 1812 became Davenport's best employees. Davenport now started in full to trade with the Sauk and the Fox, in direct competition with the American Fur Company's traders. Founded by John Jacob Astor in 1808, the American Fur Company grew to monopolize the fur trade in the United States. It was men like Astor and Davenport who were determined to capitalize on the growing demand for fur skins. George Davenport also saw opportunity with the increasing river traffic between southern Illinois and the Galena lead mines. In 1823, because of his extensive knowledge of the Mississippi River and its dangerous currents, he was asked to pilot the steamboat Virginia through the treacherous Rock Island rapids of the Mississippi River. The Virginia was the first steamboat to dock at Rock Island. Soon steamboats were frequently navigating the upper rapids, carrying workers and supplies to the lead mining regions of Dubuque and Galena. By 1823, thousands of pounds of lead were being shipped downstream to St. Louis. The lead mines became an important aspect of his business, and Davenport estimated that he would have from 80,000 to 100,000 pigs of lead the following spring. In 1824, Russell Farnham, an employee of the American Fur Company, entered into a partnership with Davenport. In 1826, the two traders contracted their trading business with Astor's American Fur Company and became agents for the trading company. George Davenport was now one of the most respected men in the region. Native Americans, settlers, and the Army alike sought Davenport's advice and counsel. In 1827, family business called Davenport back to England. He was gone for nearly a year. The future looked bright, but there were new challenges to face when Davenport returned from England. The year 1828 was a significant turning point in Rock Island history. Settlers were pushing into the upper Mississippi Valley in anticipation of land being opened there for settlement. The continuing arrival of settlers was alarming news to Davenport. Some had moved onto the Sauk lands near Saukenuk and were even living in Sauk lodges when the tribe left for their annual hunts. Not only would this intrusion create conflict with the natives, but the exclusion of certain lands also forced the Sauk and Fox to seek other areas in which to hunt. Many tribes began competing for the same hunting grounds. Davenport and Farnham's solution was to advise the U.S. government to buy the Sauk and Fox lands. Though Davenport and his partner worked hard to protect both the Indians and their own trading business, there was nothing they could do to prevent the inevitable. They were very much aware that permanent settlement was already in progress and that the Indians would have to move by reason or by force. A clash between the Sauk Fox and the settlers was inevitable, as both sides continuously harassed one another over the lands. In 1830, Davenport visited Washington City on personal business. While there, he also attempted to see President Andrew Jackson and suggest that the government pay the Indians money to relocate. The president, who declared that they should move, did not approve this plan. President Jackson, the old Cree eater, hero of New Orleans, ramrodded the Indian Removal Act through Congress in 1830. This act created the reluctant and often forcible emigration of more than 45,000 American Indians to the West. It has been called one of the unhappiest chapters in American history. On July 15, 1830, U.S. Indian Commissioner William Clark created a new treaty with the Sauk and Fox, signed by Chief Keokuk. It ceded about 26.5 million acres of Sauk and Fox land east of the Mississippi to the U.S. government. The land included the village of Saukenuk. Black Hawk and his followers did not sanction the sale of this land and were determined to regain Saukenuk. They crossed back into Illinois in 1831 and 1832. Illinois Governor John Reynolds called the 1832 return an invasion and convinced the federal government to send in Army troops. He also called up the Illinois State Militia, which drilled at Fort Armstrong. One militia captain was Abraham Lincoln, then a store clerk from New Salem, who had recently announced his candidacy for the state legislature. Among the U.S. commanders were General Winfield Scott, later the commander-in-chief of federal troops in both the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, and Colonel Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready because of his rumpled clothes. Davenport saw this as just another small uprising, knowing that Black Hawk's band numbered only about 1,000, mostly women and children, while the well-armed and supplied federal and militia troops neared 4,000 men. He was appointed assistant quartermaster and given the rank of colonel of the militia, though Davenport never used the title himself. Lurid newspaper stories, rumors, and lies escalated settlers' fears, and the uprising became known as the Black Hawk War. From Yellow Banks, near present-day Occoquan, Illinois, to their tragic end at Bad Axe River in Wisconsin, the Army and militia relentlessly pursued Black Hawk and his followers. Overall, the Black Hawk War was, in truth, a series of minor skirmishes and military blunders. Unruly and undisciplined, the state militia twice fired upon the Sauk and Fox as they tried to surrender. Black Hawk, as it soon became apparent to his followers, had no real plan. Nearing starvation, the remaining 500 Sauk and Fox hoped to escape their pursuers by crossing westward into the Missouri Territory at the confluence of the Mississippi and Bad Axe rivers. The steamboat Warrior accidentally came upon the Sauk and Fox building rafts. The Winnebago interpreter on board the boat miscommunicated Black Hawk's attempt to surrender, and the warship fired upon them with cannon and rifles. Black Hawk and some followers left during the night for reasons still unknown to this day. The next day, the Army and militia ground forces caught up with the fleeing tribe, and a wholesale slaughter began. The battle killed over 150 of the Sauk and Fox. Less than 10 U.S. infantry were killed. The Battle of Bad Axe would always be remembered as a massacre. The tribe's dream of returning to the peace and security of Saukenuk now disappeared into a fog of blood and gunsmoke. A few days later, Black Hawk surrendered, and the Black Hawk War was over. A young lieutenant named Jefferson Davis was assigned to escort Black Hawk downriver to the Jefferson Barracks, where he was held with the remaining Sauk and Fox captives. The signing of the Treaty of 1832, also known as the Black Hawk Purchase, at what is now Davenport, Iowa, formally concluded the Black Hawk War. With Black Hawk still imprisoned, Chief Keokuk represented the remaining Sauk and Fox. General Winfield Scott and Illinois Governor Reynolds conducted the meetings with Antoine Leclerc acting as translator and Colonel Davenport as witness. Included in the treaty was the government's purchase of 6 million acres of land west of the Mississippi, which became the eastern border of the state of Iowa. Antoine Leclerc was awarded 2 sections of the land for his many years of service as an Army translator. Both Leclerc and Davenport saw great opportunities for this land. Soon, a flood of settlers flowed into the Rock Island area on both sides of the river. Since 1817, the original double log cabin had served Davenport and his family as both home and trading post. But by 1832, the fur trade frontier was closing. The fur-bearing animals were nearly trapped out, more white settlers were pushing into the upper Mississippi Valley, and the Indians were forced to move west. It was time for a change in direction for the Davenport family, a new lifestyle, and a new home. Encouraging others to settle in this region, Davenport and later his sons would supply them with their material needs. Their first order of business was to build a house, not just any house, but a very grand house like no one else had built in the upper Mississippi Valley. The house began in 1833 as a 4-room, 2-story dwelling. The first floor contained a parlor and a sitting room, separated by a central hall. The second floor was comprised of 2 bedrooms and a small room or closet in the upper hall. As Davenport's family and businesses expanded, so did the house. By 1845, the house had more than doubled in size due to the addition of 2 single-story side wings, a 2-story kitchen wing at the rear, and a small rear porch. Workers went up the river to the Iowa side, across from Port Byron, Illinois, to get oak logs. After being rafted down to the house site, these logs were hewn for framing. Pine planks for the exterior of the house were the finishing touch. While the form of the house is Georgian, the styling of the original house was federal. The interior walls were lathed and rough-coated and finish plastered. This detail was a refinement not many settlers could afford at that time. Furnishings for public rooms, such as the parlor, required careful selection. It is probable that the Davenport family personally selected the parlor furnishings. In the first county election, George Davenport, along with John W. Spencer and George W. Harlan, became the first county commissioners. This represented a first step in developing local government. In 1834, the main part of the Davenport House was finished and became the center of many important historical events. In 1835, Antoine Leclerc and others met to discuss the possibility of building a town on the western bank of the Mississippi River on the site of the Fox village of Oshkosh. The Sauk and Fox had given this land to Leclerc, and its location held great potential. Their town was named Davenport in honor of the colonel. Lieutenant of the Army Corps of Engineers Robert E. Lee received his first important command in 1837. His job was to survey the upper rapids of the Mississippi River at Rock Island and the site for a future railroad bridge. Davenport and Leclerc, with their intimate knowledge of the river, gave Lee invaluable assistance. That fall, George Davenport and his son George Lost accompanied about 40 chiefs and prominent braves, including Black Hawk, to Washington, D.C. The government convinced the Sauk and Fox to cede another 1 1/4 million acres of their Iowa holdings. Davenport now devoted his time to the improvement of his business properties in Davenport and Rock Island. In June 1845, Davenport invited interested friends and colleagues to his island home to discuss the possibility of bringing the railroad to the city of Davenport. Colonel Davenport's work with Lieutenant Robert E. Lee convinced him that the railroad would soon arrive, and always far-sighted, he made plans to be part of this new enterprise. This was a logical step, which would serve the family business interests very well. Davenport's two sons, George Lost and Bailey, were groomed from the cradle to follow in their father's footsteps. George Lost began clerking for his father at age 11, collecting furs and providing goods in trade. As an adult, he was established in Davenport, having formed a partnership there with Antoine Leclerc in the mercantile and lumber business. When Bailey Davenport was 11, he began to take charge of the gardens, orchards, and other duties of the family farm. As an adult, he lived in Rock Island, was mayor for 7 terms, and owned a large farm. Out of the 1845 meeting grew the Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad Company. Construction began in 1852, and the first train reached the city of Davenport 2 years later. Sadly, the colonel never saw any of the results of that June meeting of 1845. On July 9th, 1845, posters and handbills carried the news of Davenport's brutal murder 5 days before. The news struck the community like a thunderclap and was reported in newspapers as far away as New York City and Washington, D.C. It was the afternoon of July 4th. Colonel Davenport was alone at home when he was attacked by several men, one of whom fired a pistol into Davenport's leg. The bandits then dragged him upstairs and forced him to open his safe. They had expected to find $20,000, but the safe contained less than $600. Seeking the location of more valuables, they threw Davenport onto his bed and repeatedly beat and choked him into unconsciousness, reviving him with water. The bandits found only a watch and 2 dueling pistols and then ran off, leaving the colonel to die. Davenport lived long enough to describe his attackers and died at 9 o'clock that evening. He was 61 years old. 5 men were arrested for the murder by bounty hunter Edward Bonney, who wrote a popular book recalling the arrest called The Banditti of the Prairies. The men were brought to Rock Island. 3 of them, John Long, Aaron Long, and Granville Young, were tried and hanged together in the public square. John Baxter and William Fox were also charged with the murder. Baxter died in prison, and Fox escaped before his trial. Davenport was laid to rest behind the house he built and loved. His friends among the Sauk and Fox stage a funeral ceremony for 2 days near the grave. At the end of the funeral, they placed a cedar wood post and painted it with accomplishments of their friend Saganash. Years after Davenport's death, author Frank Wilkie wrote, "He rose above the vulgar and inhuman prejudices of the age and found in the Indian, if not a brother, at least a conscientious being, who could be driven to deeds of revenge and carnage by ill treatment, or could be made a firm, reliable, honorable friend by treating him as a man. Honor to his ashes, he sleeps in a grave whose proud epitaph reads, 'Here lies a friend to humanity.'" This program is a production of the Colonel Davenport Historical Foundation. This program was supported by the following organizations: the Riverboat Development Authority, the Bechtel Trusts and Foundation, the Figge Foundation,